In the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied for president in the Electoral College, so it fell to the House of Representatives to choose. It took 36 ballots to elect Jefferson president and Burr vice president. The rivalry between these two ambitious men reached its peak in 1807 when Jefferson, then in his second term, had the former vice president arrested and tried for treason. Here with that extraordinary moment in court history is my colleague, Bob Fagan.
You may remember Aaron Burr as the man who killed Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Secretary of the Treasury in a duel. But that infamous event was only one of Burr's escapades. The 1804 duel with Hamilton signaled the end of Burr's political future in the East after his term as vice president. But he saw opportunity in the West and plotted conquest with an old friend, General James Wilkinson, governor of the new Louisiana Territory. How Burr hoped to establish his own base of power in the West remains a mystery. His supporters said he planned to capture Mexico and other Spanish possessions, but his enemies insisted he wanted to sever the western states and territories from the United States. In 1806, Burr wrote a coded letter to Wilkinson, telling him that with several hundred men, he would meet Wilkinson in early December. With rumors of insurrection threatening to implicate him, Wilkinson betrayed his friend. He sent the deciphered letter to Jefferson. Burr was arrested in March 1807 and brought to Richmond, Virginia for trial in the U.S. Circuit Court. Held in the state capitol building, the trial was one of the great public events of the time. Presiding over the trial as circuit judge was Jefferson's estranged cousin, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. Marshall, a Federalist, and Jefferson, leader of the Democratic Republicans, had long been antagonists, each determined to shape the young republic according to his own political beliefs. The grand jury returned an indictment against Burr for treason. This charge raised a constitutional issue because treason is the only crime defined in the Constitution. It states, "Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort." But before the treason issue could be taken up, Burr confronted Marshall with another constitutional question, a test of the separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary. Burr asked the court to issue a subpoena directing President Jefferson to appear at the trial and bring with him the deciphered Wilkinson letter and other papers. Jefferson's lawyers argued his claim of executive privilege, contending that the court had no power to subpoena the president to turn over documents. Relying on the Sixth Amendment, Marshall ruled that the subpoena could be issued to Jefferson because the law does not discriminate between the president and a private citizen. He conceded, though, that the president's duties to the nation might sometimes afford him an exemption from compliance. Marshall's decision established the principles of presidential accountability to the judiciary that were applied 167 years later in the Watergate case. The parties then turned to the charge of treason. The prosecution planned to call 140 witnesses to testify to Burr's treasonable intentions and actions. But after only a dozen had testified, Burr moved to exclude the testimony of all witnesses as irrelevant because none of them could testify about the overt act stated in the indictment, that Burr had levied war against the United States on Blennerhassett's Island. The prosecution had already admitted that Burr was not among the 30 or so men assembled on the island. Counsel for both sides spent days in heated debate. At last, on August 31st, Chief Justice Marshall delivered his opinion addressing how treason was to be defined and proved. Marshall doubted that Burr could be convicted simply for procuring the men who gathered on the island. Even if he could be, Burr was not charged with procuring treason, and Marshall wrote that he could only be convicted on proof of the overt acts which are charged, and the Constitution mandated that the overt act must be proved by 2 witnesses. But there were no witnesses who could offer such proof. Thus Marshall instructed the jury that all the testimony was inadmissible. With no relevant evidence to consider, the jury returned its verdict in 20 minutes. The defendant, it said, is not proved to be guilty by any evidence submitted to us. The bitterness between Marshall and the Jeffersonians only increased after the decision. Republican newspapers called for Marshall's impeachment, and there were threats of an amendment to allow removal of judges by a majority of both houses of Congress. In private, Jefferson railed that it now appears we have no law but the will of the judge. Only the spreading Napoleonic wars abroad, which occupied Jefferson's attention, brought an end to the furor. Burr, hounded by mobs and creditors, fled to Europe. He returned to New York in 1812 and practiced law there until he died at age 80 in 1836. Before he died that year, Texas won independence from Mexico, and Burr was said to have exclaimed, "I was only 30 years too soon. What was treason in me 30 years ago is patriotism today." That's a moment in court history. I'll be back with another in a future Court to Court.